Jen, if you're in the back and you can still hear me, pop in. I love seeing you play an instrument and sing at the same. How cool is that? People grow, man. People grow. We're in the middle of this series called Who Needs God? And it is a series about faith, okay? It's about trusting God. It's about seeking and walking with God, which if you've ever tried to do that, you realize it's not always easy, is it? It can be kind of tricky. And so in this series, we're acknowledging that living by faith is tough. And last week we looked at part of why it is that this is so hard. And I don't think that any of us would argue with the reality that there are certain things about theism, okay, about believing in God and Christianity in particular that kind of are unsettling. And I will tell you as well, this is just as true for me as it is for you. It took me like years of investigating Christianity in my early 20s to decide I was going to follow Jesus. And even then, it was just this back and forth thing. And now as a pastor, I wrestle with all the same stuff that you guys wrestle with. Because there are just things about theism, about belief in God that are unsettling. And consequently, because of that, sometimes we have doubts. On the other hand, I think for many of us, we look at the alternatives and we go, oh man, like there's something about a godless universe where everything is just reduced to the laws of physics and chemistry and biology that for many of us, we look at that and we go, that feels really unsettling as well. And so for a lot of us, in fact, more and more people in our country, the polls would tell us, are starting to say, you know what, to be honest, it's weird because I just kind of feel stuck in the middle. When it comes to religion and to God and to Christianity, like I have doubts. Like there are things that are unsettling. But when I think about the alternative of let's say atheism, okay, that's really not all that appealing either. Because that idea leaves me with this nagging sense of despair. And so I find that I'm just kind of caught in the middle. I'm stuck in the middle. Like, do I opt for despair? Like there's no meaning to any of this. I'm just sort of born by accident and I live and then I die. And I could try to like mine some purpose out of that. Like to pretend that there are things going on that really matter. But to be honest, that just kind of feels like despair. On the other hand, if I try to go all in with God and theism and belief in that, I'm left with all this doubt. And so I just kind of feel stuck in the middle. And so last week we ended the message with a short passage from the book of Hebrews. And if you know much about Hebrews, you realize Hebrews isn't really a book. It's a letter. It's a first century letter, so written just a couple of decades after the life of Jesus. And it was written by a Jewish Christian, okay, somebody that had grown up Jewish, but then decided that Jesus was the Messiah, and it was written to other Jewish Christians. And really, the entire letter can sort of be summed up with this central message. Don't walk away from your faith. Okay, don't walk away from your faith. And the reason that this was such a timely letter in the first century is because the recipients were people that were finding themselves stuck in the middle. Like people were wondering, is this really real? And is this really worth it? And this was particularly relevant for them because to openly trust in Jesus was very, very dangerous. And if you just look at history, you realize how dangerous it was. People were being arrested and they were being killed for their faith in Jesus. And so Hebrews is a letter of encouragement. It's a letter of encouragement saying to those that were following Jesus that had come from Jewish backgrounds, yes, it's true, and yes, it's worth it. So don't walk away from your faith. And in the middle of this struggle, the author writes to them to encourage them, and he urges them to fasten their gaze on a particular thing. So he's like, if you're caught up in all this doubt and all this worry and all this wonder, then here's what I recommend you do. Fix your gaze on one particular thing. And here's what he says. He says, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. He said, look, there's going to be a lot of unsettling things going on in this world. There are going to be a lot of things that you don't understand. There are going to be a lot of things that you just struggle to make sense of. But we are, as followers of Jesus, we are to fix our eyes on the person of Jesus. Okay, not on the church and how the church behaves. Okay, not on our church experience or whatever we've encountered there. Not the things that have happened to us in our past that we have a hard time dealing with. Okay, or the things that we wanted to have happen that didn't happen. But we are to fix our eyes on Jesus, okay, the pioneer and the perfecter of our faith. And so if you're here this morning and you're somebody that would say, you know what, to be honest with you, I definitely am finding myself stuck in the middle these days. If you're finding that you're wrestling with some kinds of doubts, then I have a question that I just want you to mull over today, and we're going to kind of keep coming back to this. Here's the question. What is the faith that you're struggling to maintain fixed on or fastened to? Okay, the faith that you're struggling with, the faith that you find yourself doubting, what is the faith that you're struggling to maintain fixed on or fastened to? Is your faith really built on something else, like not Jesus? And if so, then what is it? What is it that builds your faith? What is the foundation of your faith? Is it how you feel? Is it how you feel? Is it the Bible? Is it the church? Your experience with the church, the way Christians behave? Ultimately, what is the foundation of this whole thing for you? Because Hebrews says, like, if we're followers of Jesus, then we should do this. We should fix our eyes on Jesus. And as we sort of progress through this series today, I want to address one obstacle that may stand in the way for some of you of being able to do that. And here's the struggle for a lot of people. Here's the struggle. It's just assumed that Christianity requires mind-numbing, experience-denying faith. If you're going to be a Christian, here's how it works, right? It requires mind-numbing, experience-denying faith. And so a huge problem for a lot of people, then, with Christianity, is the necessity of faith. But it requires faith. So in order to be a believer, I have to check my brain at the door. There are things that I just can't really fully explore, science and lots of other things. Or I have to pretend that certain things didn't happen to me. Or I have to pretend that this thing and it didn't happen to my friend in the past. I have to pretend that this thing didn't happen to my mom or this thing didn't happen to my dad. And see, if you feel like Christianity requires mind-numbing, experience-denying faith, here's what I want you to know. Here's something every Christian should know. The original version didn't. The original version of Jesus did not. So Jesus' followers did not go around pretending things were better than they were. They were pretty in touch with reality. They saw all the suffering and they saw all the heartache, and they did not ignore all of those realities in the world. In fact, on the night before his death, after the Last Supper, Jesus was trying to explain the way things were going to go down. And he could see that the disciples were wrestling with it. They were just churning. They were really struggling with it. And so he told them, if you're having a hard time believing me, then don't just believe me. Believe based on what you've seen. He's like, think about what you've seen. Believe based on what you've experienced. Guys, if you're having a hard time believing in me, then Jesus says, at least believe on the evidence of the works themselves. Think about what you've seen. Think about what you've encountered. Think about what you've experienced. And guys, that's what they did. So when you think about the original Christians, they didn't believe in spite of the evidence. They believed precisely because of it. And there's a lot of confusion around this these days. And I think it comes down to what we mean when we use the word faith. What do we mean when we use the word faith? And so today, I just want to talk a little bit about the nature of faith. What is faith? And what is the role of faith in the Christian life? And I want to start with a couple of things that faith is not. And some of you are going to find yourself objecting. And so that's okay, but object quietly. Because you grew up in a faith system that taught you exactly what I'm about to tell you is wrong. Okay? First of all, faith is not a force or a power. It's not a force or power. Faith is not an energy that we somehow harness to be able to manipulate God. Okay, that's like Luke Skywalker. That's not a Jesus thing. And some of you have grown up with this concept of faith that, like, if you or a group of people, if you or some group of people, if you just have enough faith, if you can get yourself to a spot where you just have enough faith, then and only then can you get God to act on your behalf. And maybe you believed that. And you believed it, and you believed it, and then you entered into a circumstance in your life that was difficult, and you found that it didn't work quite right. And now you find yourself, in response to that, wondering if any of it's really true. Because you look back on it and you go, you know what I did? I believed and believed and believed. And you go like, I prayed and I prayed and I prayed. And then the pastor came over and he prayed and he prayed for your mom or he prayed for your sister. Like he came to the hospital and everybody believed and everybody believed and everybody believed and everybody prayed and everybody had extraordinary faith. And they prayed these powerful prayers. And yet God didn't answer them. The prayers went unanswered. And so you started to wonder, based on that experience, well, is there then a God that can be trusted at all? But here's the thing. Here's the thing. Faith is not a force or power that we somehow tap into. You know what that's called? It's called magic. That's called magic. And when Jesus talked about faith, that's not what he was talking about. Here's something else. Faith is not a formula. It's not a formula. Faith is not like a PIN code, right? It's not a PIN code where if you punch in the right combination, it somehow unlocks God. And he starts just spitting stuff out. It's not something that like only really deep people get. Like if you want to have the kind of faith where God responds, you got to get really deep, man. It's not about standing a certain way, posturing your body. It's not about kneeling a certain way. It's not about raising your hands. It's not about saying some magic combination of words. It's not a mystery to unlock. It's not a formula to be used. So what is faith then? Well, the writer of Hebrews spells it out. And it turns out that it's really not that mysterious. It's not all that complicated. And it's also, hear me on this, it's not the primary reason we follow Jesus. What? It's not the primary reason we follow Jesus. Okay, faith plays a very important role in the life of a Christian. And we're about to see what it is. But we don't follow Jesus because we just got to have faith, man. Okay, so the same author that pleads with us to fix our eyes on Jesus explains the nature of faith this way. It says, now faith is confidence in what we hope for. Faith is confidence in what we hope for. And right off the bat, he introduces another word, hope. So what in the world is hope? Well, hope is, and I'm trying to make this memorable, hope is wanting something to be with no guarantee. Hope is wanting something to be with no guarantee. Say that with me one time. Hope is wanting something to be with no guarantee. And the reason you know that's true is because it rhymes. Okay, so listen, it's wanting something to be with no guarantee. You hope to get a raise. You hope to get a bonus. Some of you hope to get married. Others of you like, that's too far out. I hope to get a date. Okay, I'm hoping for a date. So faith happens when hope so becomes confidence that something will be so. It's when that transition takes place. That's when faith kicks in. But that leads us to another question, and that's this. What makes us confident that hope so will become be so? What makes us confident? In other words, what has to happen for hope so to become be so? What has to happen inside us or around us so that something that we hope will happen turns to confidence that it actually will happen? Where does that confidence come from? So the writer of Hebrews makes a second statement to give clarity. He writes, now, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. But once again, we're left asking the question, well, how do we get from hope so to assurance? That's the problem, right? You're like, that's what I'm struggling to do. How do I get from hope so to assurance? How do I get from I don't see it to I'm absolutely sure I'm going to see it? Well, it's almost like the answer to that is so simple that the author doesn't even try to explain it, because everybody reading this already knew the answer to that question. And so let me put the answer to this, or let me kind of frame this in a context that I think all of us can understand and relate to. How will you know you got the raise? How will you know you got the raise? Well, how about this one? Maybe it's when your boss walks into your office and says, hey, guess what? I know you've been hoping for a raise. Here's the good news. I'm giving you a raise. Does that provide a little more assurance? See, when your boss promises you a raise, then your hope moves from hope to faith. And at that point, so after an experience like that, you don't go home, right, to your husband or your wife and say, honey, I hope I'm getting a raise. No, you go home and you say, I know, let's go out and celebrate. I know for certain I'm getting a raise. Well, how do you know? Because my boss told me so. He or she promised me so. The reason that you know you're going to get a bonus is because the right person, somebody with the authority to actually do something, tells you you're going to get a bonus. And once they tell you, once they confirm it, then hope becomes faith. Suddenly there's assurance that this thing is going to happen. Assurance comes, confidence becomes because there's a promise. So you hope she'll go out with you, right? You hope she'll go out with you, and you hope and you hope and you hope, and suddenly you get a text that says, sounds great, 7:30 works for me. And so hope so moves to believe so. Hope moves to faith. Hope becomes confidence and assurance. And so you text your best friend and you're like, I hope she said, No, you text your friend and you're like, she said yes, he said yes. Like you're all in because of the promise. So let's go back to the writer of Hebrews. What is he saying faith is? It's pretty simple. He's saying faith is this. It's confidence that God is real and that he'll do what he promised. Faith is confidence that God is real and he'll do what he promised. Now, for the sake of our discussion today, here's something that's incredibly important. I just want to point this out because people in our culture are really confused about this. We do not believe that God is real because of faith. And we don't believe that God keeps his promises because of faith. See, we don't believe that God is real because of faith. We believe God is real because there's evidence. And we believe, when you think about that, you go, okay, well, what do you mean? Well, if there's no evidence that God is real, what the heck are we all doing? Come on, man. We believe that God is real because there's evidence. And in the same way, we don't believe that God keeps his promises just because of faith. We believe that God keeps his promises because of evidence. We believe because God has already kept his promises. So Christian faith is simple. It's confidence that God is real and that he'll do what he promised. Okay, now back to the letter of Hebrews. Here's what the author says. It says, now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. And everybody reading it would say, yep, that's right. You get the confidence once you get the promise. And then the writer points out, this is what the ancients were commended for. It says this is what the ancients were commended for. And this is where the author launches into this long list of ancient Jewish people that had already lived and died. And we sometimes refer to this list in this chapter of Hebrews as the Hall of Faith. People that were heroes of Judaism. And this is what he's calling the ancients. So all of the Jewish people that were reading this, they knew all about these people. They were raised, they grew up on these stories. So he just rattles off kind of a random list of these ancient Jewish people and how they lived. And he names one, he's like, they lived by faith, and by faith, and by faith, and by faith. They all lived by faith. They believe that God is real and that God keeps his promises. And so in every story, he says, these people were given a promise, and they all lived as if God is real and God keeps his promises. So one of those heroes that he talks about, one of the ones he talks about first is a guy that most of us, I think, have heard of. His name is Abraham. Quick survey. If before you came in today, you had heard of Abraham, would you just raise your hand? Okay. Just want to make sure you're with me and you're with the writer of Hebrews. And if you hadn't heard of Abraham, that's okay. But he tells the story of Abraham. He reminds them of the story of Abraham. Abraham left home. And we go, well, why did Abraham leave home? What's the background? Was it his mom's cooking? Right? Was his little sister always in his space? Why did Abraham leave home? Well, Abraham left home because God said, I want you to leave home, and I'm going to do something amazing through you. So Abraham had faith, and he believed God's promise. And then he took a risk, and he acted on that promise. That's Abraham. And the writer lists off a bunch of guys. There's another guy. He talks about Gideon. And if you know the story of Gideon's story, it's a crazy story. Gideon's people keep getting attacked. They're being raided by all of the surrounding people, the Midianites. And so God has Gideon raise up this massive army. But then God says, you know what, Gideon? If you defend your families and your land with this massive army, you guys are going to think to yourselves, look at how strong we are. Aren't we awesome? So he says, I don't want you to take the whole army. Scratch that. I know you raised up a bunch of guys. I want you to go against the 6,000 Midianites, but I want you to only do it with 300 guys. But don't worry. Don't worry at all. I'll make sure you win. I'll go before you. I'll protect you, but you have to trust me. Now, if you know the story, you know Gideon kind of wrestled with that. He's like, that's kind of risky. And so he kind of goes back and forth. He wasn't so sure. And then after a few days of uncertainty, God just kept meeting him and kept meeting him and kept meeting him, kept inviting him. And eventually, Gideon trusted God, and he did what he asked, and God did just what he said. And crazy stuff happened, and this little band of men defeated this huge army. And so the writer of Hebrews says, see, that's faith. Gideon trusted that God is real and that God keeps his promises. That's faith. It's simple. And he's like, and it's a big, big deal. Then the writer of Hebrews talks about Moses. And Moses, if you know the story of Moses, Moses left Egypt as a fugitive. He walked out of Egypt with a price on his head. And then we know the story, kind of the crux of the story is Moses goes back to Egypt. Now, why in the world would someone go back to a place where they're a fugitive, where they're wanted? Why go back to a place where you're a wanted man? Well, it's because God said to Moses, I want you to go back. And if you'll go back, I promise I will liberate the people of Israel from being slaves to the Egyptians. So faith is simple. Faith is believing God is real, which is based on evidence, not just based on blind faith. And faith is believing that God will keep his promises. Because God has a history of keeping his promises. Now here's the really tricky part in all this. All the ancients that the writer of Hebrews talks about, all of these like heroes of the faith that were past tense when he wrote, all of them believed in God's global promise to the world. Because God spoke to Abraham 2,000 years before Jesus showed up, and just to get a timeline in our minds, how far away are we from Jesus on the other side, approximately? 2,000 years. So now we're talking 2,000, we're a long ways away. Are we not a long ways away from Jesus? Okay, well, Abraham was just as far from Jesus on the other side. 2,000 years before Jesus. God came to Abraham and he made a promise. And all the Jewish heroes listed in Hebrews, so Moses and Gideon and all the rest, they all trusted in this global promise that God made to Abraham. So not only did they trust in God's specific promises to them, like victory in a particular battle or the freedom of Israel from Egypt, Not only did they believe God with that stuff, but they believed in God's global promise to Abraham, the big one. And here's the promise that God made to Abraham. Again, this is 2,000 years before Jesus shows up. And you go, well, how do we know that? Well, there's a lot of people that have, like archaeologists and stuff, that are way smarter than me, that have done, they go back. This is real. This was out there way, way before Jesus. God said to Abraham, I will make you into a great nation. Now, let me pause here and just ask a quick question. Did Abraham eventually become a nation? Guys, this is not a trick question. Did Abraham eventually become a nation? Okay. What nation did Abraham eventually become? Israel. Excellent. So God says, that's interesting. That's kind of a big promise. I don't know, maybe some of you could name another person that eventually became a nation. Probably not. God says, I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. He says, I will make your name great and you will be a blessing. Now, keep in mind that when these were originally written down, these were obscure texts that belonged to very obscure people. Okay, the nation of Israel was not a powerhouse. This was an insignificant people whose writings were like meaningless to the rest of the world. These texts had no value whatsoever. But God tells Abraham that he'll make his name great. And I just find that to be interesting because a few minutes ago, most of us said that we'd heard of Abraham. Weird. Like here we are 4,000 years later on the other side of the world, and most Americans have heard of Abraham. Huh, that's crazy. And you know what else is weird? Abraham, it turns out, is like the central character to three major world religions. He's exalted by the Jews, by Christians, and by Muslims. So pretty much anywhere you go in the world, the people know all about Abraham. What a coincidence. That's so weird. So, okay, I guess you can put a check by that one. And the reality is that's all the warm-up act. Here's the big one. God says to Abraham, I will make your name great and you will be a blessing. Well, what does that mean? Okay, here it comes. And I think this is awesome. This is staggering. And you think about the context in which this promise was delivered, and they started to recite this to one another. It says, I will make your name great and you will be a blessing, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. That's a big one. Now, when God made this promise to Abraham, it didn't make any sense. It didn't make any sense because peoples didn't bless peoples. Okay, tribes didn't bless tribes. Nations didn't bless nations. Nations conquered. Nations pillaged. Nations enslaved other nations. This is how it worked. But God says, I'm going to do something new. I'm going to do something beautiful. Abraham, I'm going to turn you into a nation. And your nation is not just going to bless like the surrounding tribes and families within your nation. Your nation is going to bless the entire earth. And then, 2,000 years later, a Jewish carpenter would come along, an Israelite, a Hebrew, a descendant of Abraham, Jesus, and he would bless the whole world. Jesus would pave the way to God's complete grace and complete renewal. He paved the way for all the people that had come before him, and he paved the way for all that would come after him. And so, back to the writer of Hebrews. Here's what he says about this. Because again, he was writing just a few years after Jesus. Here's what he said about these ancient Jewish people, the ones that had looked forward to this promise. He writes, all these people were still living by faith when they died. All these people were still living by faith when they died. So all of the people described in the Hall of Faith by the author of Hebrews, Abraham, Moses, Gideon, and the rest of them, all of these people were living by faith when they died. They all believed God was going to do something for the world in the future through Abraham, but they didn't get to see it happen. They died before it happened, okay? They lived by faith. So they lived throughout their lives with faith of what was coming. This faith that God is real and God keeps his promises. That God would keep his promise to them personally, and then one day, someday, in a way that we can't even possibly imagine, they thought to themselves, God is somehow going to bless the entire world through the descendants of Abraham. What is that going to look like? And they had no idea. Now, it's really important that we get a clear understanding of what faith is, of what faith does, and what faith doesn't do. Nobody in the ancient Jewish scriptures in the Old Testament, and none of Jesus' original followers, nobody used faith to try to gain leverage with God. Like, people believe that God is God, and God could not be manipulated. But they absolutely believed that God could be trusted, which is different. Okay, nobody believed that God could be manipulated. What they believed is that God could be trusted. And that was the understanding of faith. God is real, and God keeps his promises. And so, the people of faith just lived their lives in light of that and trusted that God would do good things. In fact, there's a really cool picture of this in the life of Jesus. Jesus is walking, and he's with his guys. And the scripture tells us, and I don't think we can really imagine this, but a man who was covered in leprosy, like this horrific, disfiguring disease that everyone was terrified by because it was so contagious. This man comes and he falls at the feet of Jesus. And he makes this statement, and this is so powerful because this is such a great example of faith. Here's what he said. He said, Lord, which is like a title of deep respect. He said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Not, Lord, I believe you will. I believe you will. I believe you will. And not, my friends are back home and they're praying and we believe you will. We believe you will. We believe you will. Now see, that actually isn't faith. That's presumption. Instead, it's, Lord, I have the perfect faith that if you are willing, you can. If you're willing, you can. And why would a leper be absolutely confident that Jesus could heal him? The answer is because he knew that Jesus had healed other people. He witnessed it. He saw it. He talked, they were everywhere. He didn't go to Jesus because he just sort of somehow conjured up some faith. He went to Jesus because of the evidence, because of what he'd seen, because of what he'd heard. He went to Jesus because of his experience. So because of the facts, because of what had already happened, because of what he'd seen and all that had already been confirmed, he went to Jesus confident that Jesus could do for him what he needed. And I love here how Jesus responded. It says, Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said. Be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him. Now, the fact that Jesus didn't just heal him, but he touched him, it communicated so much in that culture. So much love and so much acceptance. And it drove the religious leaders crazy because you aren't supposed to touch unclean things. But the amazing thing with Jesus was this. When Jesus touched unclean people, Jesus didn't acquire their disease. The opposite happened. And they were healed. If you are willing, the man said, I am willing. And Jesus healed the man. And Jesus is like, that's all the faith I'm looking for. Not faith that you know I will. I'm just looking for faith that you know I can. But many of us were not taught that that kind of faith is real faith. Some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. Many of us were taught that you have to believe that he will. God isn't going to act on your behalf unless you are certain that he will. That's a hard place to get to, isn't it? That faith is a kind of force. It's kind of power. And you think, well, if you have enough, then somehow, this is what we're taught. If we get enough of that, somehow we can guarantee that God will act on our behalf. But this, I believe you can, faith is considered weak. Well, that's weak faith. And we're told that what we have to have is this, I believe you will faith. Somehow I've got to get there. But I just throwing this out, does that make any sense at all? Like when it comes to personal things that I'm asking for from God that, well, God, I just know that you will, and I know that you will, and I know that you will, and if I can get to the spot where I'm sure that you will, then I know you'll do it for me. Well, how the heck do I know? God, I know you will get me that house. God, I know you will get that car for me. God, I know you will get me that girl. I believe, I believe, I believe. God, I believe you'll heal me. I believe, I know, I believe you will, you'll heal me. And we go, just wait a minute. Is that really what faith is supposed to be? And yet this is what gets communicated all the time. And it's funny because Christians, there's something about that we kind of realize is ridiculous. But Christians kind of resist the I believe you can kind of faith. And here's why. Here's why. Because it leaves God in control. So I have some good news for you. God is in control. And for me, for one, thank God he is. Thank God he is, right? Because the 19-year-old version of me, I wanted to marry a girl named Sonia. And I prayed and prayed and prayed, and I believed and I believed and I believed. I just became a Christian when I was dating her. I just believed and believed and believed. And thankfully, God is not my puppet. Because I'll just tell you guys right now, Sonia ain't no Jen. Yeah. God's ways are higher. Look, we don't really like the I believe you can kind of faith. It feels like weak sauce. I don't like that kind of faith. We want to make it more certain than that. If I just believe you will hard enough, then, but that's not Christianity. It's never been Christianity. It's never been Christianity. That is, you know what that is? That's paganism. That's paganism. That makes the gods our little puppets, which is what the pagans did with Zeus and Apollos and Athena and all that stuff. If I can do just the right thing in just the right way, I can get the gods to do my bidding. That's not Christianity. That's not Jesus. And see, if we're taught that faith works like that, here's the big problem. If we're taught that this is how it all works, then when we don't get the girl, or when we don't get the job, okay, when we don't get the promotion, when we don't get the bonus, when the cancer isn't healed and mom dies, then there's really only two explanations for what's happening. One is, I didn't have enough faith. I didn't have enough faith. The problem here is me. And then we just live with intense guilt and regret. The other one is, maybe this whole God thing isn't real. Maybe this whole God thing isn't real. And then we lose faith. Those are both really bad options. We lose faith in that situation, a faith that was founded on something that was never, ever legit to start with. Now, here's why this is such a big deal. People don't understand this, and they are walking away from God by the droves. And here's what's happening. People are walking away from God because we are signing God's name to promises that God never made. And it's no wonder that people's faith is falling apart. My goodness. It's no wonder that the whole thing is just crashing and crumbling down for so many people. No wonder they can't maintain confidence in God. And maybe this is you. Maybe this is you. You hear this, you go, yeah. Because maybe you were holding God accountable to things that God never actually promised to do. And we talked last week about different childhood sort of understandings of God. We looked at these like childhood versions of God. And if you grew up with some of these, you've been through this. Maybe you were taught that God was making promises to you that he wasn't actually making. Some of you were taught that God is kind of like a vending machine, right? If you put in enough money, if you put in enough time, if you go to church enough, if you pray enough, if you do the things that you're supposed to do, you're a good little boy or a good little girl, then God will spit the things out that you're looking for. Or if you were raised kind of like by the bodyguard version of God, right? The bad things never happen to good people, God. Then as you grew up and you experienced life, of course you lost faith. Bad things happen to good people all the time. But I just want to say that was never the Christian faith to start with. That was never God never promised any of those things. And here's the thing that we need to build our faith upon. Not that God demonstrates his love to us in those things. God doesn't demonstrate his love by promising that nothing bad will happen to you. That's ridiculous. And deep down, we all know it is. God doesn't demonstrate his love to you by promising that every disease will be healed if we just pray with faith. And if you look into that stuff to be sure that God loves you, then I just want to tell you, you're being set up for failure. It's going to be really disappointing. But there is a place that God wants us to look. And the Apostle Paul explained it this way. He said, "But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." God demonstrates his love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. See, the trustworthiness of God was actually settled in Jesus. It's not up for debate every time we pray. Every time we make a request. Well, I don't know. If God doesn't come through on this one, then I just don't know. I mean, God's love for us was demonstrated in Jesus, and his trustworthiness was demonstrated to us in Jesus. In Jesus, God delivered on his global promise to bless the entire world, and that includes you, and it includes me. And we're told that it gets even cooler than that. One day, God is going to heal all disease. One day, God will deliver us from every injustice. One day, there will be no more pain, no more suffering, no more mourning, no pain. He will wipe away every tear from our eyes. And we look forward to that day in faith because of the evidence we've seen in the past. But today is not that day. And we can't hold him to promises that he's not made. God's given us evidence. And we can have confidence that God is real. We can have confidence that he keeps his promises because 2,000 years ago, Jesus did something extraordinary. Because of the historicity of it. Just look at how historical it is, and it's staggering. The evidence for Jesus and his life and his miracles and his death and his resurrection is actually incredible. Now, if you look at all that and you don't find the evidence compelling, then you shouldn't believe. I'm just telling you right now, you shouldn't believe. You don't just believe just because. You don't just put faith in faith. We have faith because there's evidence. Jesus isn't asking us to put faith in faith. He's asking us to let the evidence speak for itself. And to let the evidence give us confidence and assurance so that we can live with hope and we can live with faith. Faith that God is real and faith that God keeps his promises. So if you're finding yourself these days caught in the middle, then the invitation really from God is so simple. We are invited to fix our eyes on Jesus. And again, if you've been struggling these days, if you're stuck in the middle, I just want to bring it back to the question we started with. What is it that you've been looking to? What is it that really is the foundation of your faith? Like, has it been Jesus or has it been something else? And I just want to say, if it's been something else and you're struggling to maintain faith, maybe you need to refocus. And God is inviting you right back into that with open arms.